essentially, as was discussed by Annalise, the other item I think of importance to the region, but also globally, is the ongoing discussion on maximum limits for lead in certain foods. Now, there are a number of items that are being discussed at step 4. So essentially, this is in fact, the first time that the committee is discussing them, and others that were adopted last year at step 5, and that they have been circulated for comments at 6, and now the committee will be considering them at step 7. So again, as was mentioned by Annalise, lead is an important chemical contaminant that is found in the environment, and the environmental contamination may lead to contamination of food. So essentially, we are seeing quite a bit of exposure coming from food sources, and the general risk management approach is an approach that is based on the ALARA principle, meaning as low as reasonably achievable, and also with an emphasis on reduction of point source introduction. So essentially, any reservoir of lead should be avoided, and that's why in a lot of instances, a number of regulatory requirements impose to eliminate lead from any type of tool for food production. And we can essentially support these efforts with the adoption of maximum levels that are there to help verify, if you will, the effectiveness of some of these reduction measures. So again, the MLs are only one additional tool that is there as part of the arsenal of risk management. And Codex has been working on this for some time now. This is a reminder of the committee's main decisions during the previous session as it relates to lead. Now, the list for which Codex started considering the development of these maximum levels was actually quite big, and that got reduced to a certain extent last year. Discontinuation of work on fresh eggs, on dried garlic, and also on molasses due to insufficient data to establish a maximum level. There were some items that were adopted, as was mentioned earlier by Annalise. So at step 5.8, so 0.02 ppm was adopted for cereal-based foods for infants and young children. A value of 0.1 ppm was adopted for white and refined sugar, corn syrup, maple, and honey. And in fact, right now, what the committee will be considering will be the unrefined sugar sources, so essentially to complement these values. And also there was the adoption of 0.1 ppm for sugar-based candies. Now, as was mentioned, the committee will be looking at separate MLs for brown and raw sugar. Now, these are considered to be commodities of high value, and they are being traded internationally. So that's why these MLs would be of interest for Codex to develop, and they will be complementary to the levels that were adopted for the processed products or the refined products. The committee will also be continuing the discussion on a possible ML for ready-to-eat meals for infant and young children. There was the adoption of a value of 0.02 ppm at step 5, but again, the electronic working group was asked to continue considering this ML with a study of the impact on certain foods that may not be able to achieve this level. And in fact, the committee decided to reestablish the electronic working group, which was led by Brazil. This year, the focus will be on ready-to-eat meals for infant and children, also on these unrefined sugars, so brown and raw sugar. But also there is a mandate to consider next year some maximum levels for culinary herbs and spices. Now, what the committee will be looking at is some suggestions that came from the electronic working group. And these suggestions are a value of 0.15 milligram per kilogram for the unrefined sugars. For the ready-to-eat meals for infant and young children, there are a couple of options that the working group came up with. Either to look at adopting a value of 0.02 milligram per kilogram for all, or potentially to consider to have some exclusion of products that are unable to meet the 0.02, and to consider potentially 0.03 for these products. I note that there is in fact just a mistake in it was basically the reverse. The values to be excluded would concern mostly products containing grain that were found not to be meeting or not to be able to achieve. When I say not to be able to achieve, this is on the basis of a rejection rate that was considered by the committee, which is essentially a 5% rejection rate. And this brings me to really summarize very briefly the approach that was followed by the electronic working group. Mostly the electronic working group looked at the data that was made available in the GEMS food database, looked at also the way food categories were classified. So for example, for sugars, they tried to make them simple. So essentially there were so many ways that sugar were listed, and they tried to put some categories together to come up with only 3 categories that were left there. So classifying foods, and of course following the ALARA principle as a guiding principle, looking at a rejection rate that would be at 5 or below 5%. And the approach also that was used was to consider that when essentially you have an LOQ or an LOD, we would be considering that this, well, when you have a 0, when you have something that is not detected or not quantified, we will be considering this finding as being the LOQ or the LOD, which is essentially the upper bound approach. Now, the electronic working group also worked on the data in such a way that they excluded data that were available in the database where essentially the finding was determined using a methodology whose LOQ or LOD was in fact higher than the value of the ML proposed. So this is really in an attempt to look at data that was generated with methods that are sensitive enough, essentially to be able to achieve the proposed LOD or the proposed maximum level. So this is where we're at right now. The proposal here is to look at whether the maximum level that is recommended by the electronic working group, which is a single maximum level for all raw and untreated sugar, so all these categories at 0.15 milligram per kilogram, but also to look at this option for the ready-to-eat meals for infants and young children, and to see whether we can adopt 0.02 milligrams per kilogram, so 0.02 ppm, knowing that some items, essentially the grain-containing foods, would be exceeding the 5% rejection rate. So this is, a discussion point, and it would be great to see the positions of the different countries on this item. Maybe I'll pause here, and maybe Ruth, I think actually Lisa advised us that you would be providing us also with the analysis that New Zealand did. If you don't mind actually giving also your analysis or your opinion about this one.
No, thank you. I guess with this particular topic, it was initially a bit of quite a bit of interest in New Zealand, just because we've had a couple of lead contamination issues with sugar. But in terms of like our positions with regards to the ML proposals that are being put forward, I think we're quite comfortable with the proposal for the 0.15 milligrams per kilogram for all raw and untreated sugar products. I think one thing that we sort of had to balance was, of course, we looked at the results for lead in these products that we had tested in New Zealand, but we also had to consider obviously the practicality of being able to test at the border, because obviously that's something that we have to factor in when we are coming to an agreement on a position. So again, we would have perhaps have gone with a lower limit, but we had to sort of balance that with the practicalities of those who are doing the testing and the analysis. So our front of line staff. In regards to the single ML for the ready to eat meals for infants and young children, I think that because there was a virtual working group for this particular agenda item just last night, and I think it's still being put forward for discussion at plenary next week. There isn't any sort of firm agreement on whether people are okay with the 0.02 or a higher limit. So I'd be interested in seeing where that lands next week. And I guess one thing that was being cited was obviously the ML that was adopted last year and put forward towards the this maximum level, which is 0.02.
Am I the only one, or we're losing you, Ruth?
I think we're losing her.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're losing her on my end too.
Okay, so I think we heard at least that, you know, there seems to be more concurrence on the 0.15, even though a lower level would be favored. But here there are some discussions. But again, the committee adopted something similar last year related to cereal-based foods for infants and young children. So this was the cereal-based ones. And this is the category, at least the grain-based category seems to be the one that seems to be not achieving the rejection rate of 5%. Basically, you go at a higher rejection rate if you consider 0.02. 0.03 would get us to the 5%. And this is the topic of discussion. So it would be interesting to see other countries' positions on this one.
Let me throw in, just from the US point of view now, I'll put a caveat. I don't go to this committee. I don't know the subject. So I'm just reading what the US position is, right? I'm not an expert in this area. So we agree with everything on the sugars except for Mascavo, because it's not a common name for panela. And there was no data on Mascavo were reported in the GEMS food. So we're concerned about that they have for Mascavo. On the cereals ones, the United States does not support excluding products containing cereals from the proposal of the ML of 0.02 milligrams a kilogram for ready-to-eat meals for infants and young children, given that Codex established an ML of 0.2 milligram per kilogram for cereal-based foods for infants and young children in 2022.
Which is what is written here. So
which is what they're saying. So that's one thing the delegate will raise.
Okay.
They're also asking to clarify in the plenary whether the ML for ready-to-eat meals applies to single ingredient foods such as carrots and apples,
okay,
in addition to multi-ingredient foods. And then they question the analysis as well, why they went with a 95% percentile on sugars, the LOQ greater than ML of 0.2 for the ready-to-eat meals. They're saying that this approach should be considered further by the electronic working group, which maybe they did last night, based on the guidance on data analysis for the development of maximum levels, improved data collection in Codex before CCCF endorses the approach for future work. So that's the US position as I understand it. And again, I'm no expert in this area.
No, this is no, definitely. Thank you very much. I think Ken, that summarizes it very nicely. I think there is a similar concern from a number of countries about this exclusion element, and I think also the methodology that was used by the electronic working group with the exclusion of some data seems to have been really raising some concern from a number of delegations, because it was not the general methodology that was adopted in previous analysis. So that's what we can say at this point. Any other points that any other country would like to raise for this one?
Just on, can I just ask a silly question?
No silly questions, Scott. No silly questions. There's no such thing.
On the yeah, so where we're sort of saying they'd set the same value previously for cereal-based foods for infants. am I right in thinking that with this sort of ML, because there is no safe level and it's based on ALARA, that so they don't take into account dietary exposure and that kind of thing in
Well,
this. So I guess where I'm going with this is like there might be other instances where with other MLs where you would say, okay, ready to eat meals or something maybe incorporates a larger group of foods or something, and therefore maybe there's a difference between what they set for cereal-based foods and maybe ready-to-eat meals or something. But in this instance, that wouldn't make sense. Does my question make sense?
No, I think I understand your question. I guess the cereal-based foods is a definitely broad category. You know, it encompasses, and actually cereal-based foods also, there might be even questions about you know, what is the percentage of cereal? You see, in this particular case, the way when they did the analysis of the data, and here I'm really telling you based on my reading of the material, okay, and because there was quite a bit of material, believe me, on this one, it was a huge set of information that was available. The categorization of products was a little bit different because basically here they focused on ready-to-eat meals, okay? So it's a very focused category. What they found is that the subcategory of ready-to-eat meals for infants and young children that was grain-based was not possible to meet it. When I say meet it, meet what? Meet the criteria set by the committee, which is 5% of rejection. Basically, they were, I think, closer to 8%, like a higher level of percentage of rejection, okay? But then actually, when you think of grain-based, you know, ready-to-eat meals, basically there was a question as to how much of these grain-based are cereal-based. You know, so because in the grain based, a lot of them are cereal based. So essentially, when we think of that, is that some of these are part of the category that was adopted last year. So it may be the fact that of not achieving the 5% is also related to the way the data was skewed, the data was treated. You know what I mean? So in this particular case, the question was, should we exclude the grain-based that are not able to meet the 5% rejection rate? Or should we still try to have a 0.02 and see essentially what the impact of that will be? And apparently, most of the comments that we're having is this exclusion doesn't necessarily make sense. That I think the 0.02 should be considered, particularly on the basis of what we said, which is that lead has no safe level, and we're trying to push ALARA in this particular case. There doesn't seem to be any data that is robust enough to say that this will pose an important element for international trade, because it's only based on that analysis of the electronic working group on data that is as complete as people submitted. So the data is also could be skewed, you know? So this is where the discussion will be. Now, I mean, it's anybody's guess where this discussion will go. You know, if we get consensus on moving with 5.8 to move to 8, because this one is at step 5 already. So it could go to 8 if essentially we get consensus. It could also potentially be left at the same level and maybe ask for more data or a different way of analyzing the data, and essentially come back to it next year. Given that we're not done with lead, next year we will be bringing back lead in this committee. The committee will be considering the spices and culinary herbs for NML. So the topic is not closed. So these are the two options here, and we're going to be seeing how the discussions go next week.
Thank you.
Now, I guess for the region, though, there are a couple of recommendations that we're making, in fact, here. And they're not really related to the MLs themselves. I think it's very important that the region looks at its current data. What do we have from the Southwest Pacific Islands right now in terms of the data that is available for sale, and looking at what are the monitoring programs doing in order to identify the levels of lead in foods amongst those that Codex is proposing levels. And I think it's also important that competent authorities engage with the production sector to document the potential impacts of these MLs. I believe for the most part, the products that we're talking about are imported products in the Pacific Islands. So not necessarily produced locally, but nonetheless, I think having that type of information will be useful. And having that information reflected in the GEMS food database will also allow JECFA to make its assessments, or the electronic working group to make its assessment, taking into account the realities of the region. So this is a general recommendation that is made. Ruth, now that you're back with us, any other comments from your end?
Apologies for that. I think it might be my internet connection. I'm working from home. No, nothing to add, but yeah, definitely agree with the, I guess the questions that keep coming up is obviously the way that the commodity has been categorized, as well as I guess, yeah, some issues with the way that the data has been analyzed. And I guess to come now to your point about, obviously looking at what data is available within the South, West Pacific region, I can see how the importance of, being able to input into the database is of value. I know from a New Zealand perspective, we definitely do try and look out for, I guess, any future agenda items or, things that are of interest to the committee or to JECFA to input data into the database. And so, for example, I guess we try to also incorporate where there is, I guess, South Pacific products that are coming into New Zealand. We do try and flag that with, I guess, our trading partners that, look, these are the detections that we got. And we are looking to obviously share this on the database, and it is anonymized, so it won't be necessarily, tracked back to that particular producer. But yeah.
Thank you for that, Ruth.